Loud, connecting. We're recording. Lovely. Okay. Well, thank you for all of you for joining us tonight. We are excited to hear more about the history of Fort Sewall, but just a couple of items before we do get started. First off, we do have some upcoming events. Saturday is going to be our last 2020 Marblehead Memories monthly meeting. Don't worry, they will be back in 2021. Saturday's topic is holidays. So join us at 10 a.m. via Zoom. You'll get an email reminder tomorrow morning. You'll see the link on Facebook. The link is on our website. So please join us Saturday at 10 a.m. It should be about an hour long. And if you don't have any stories to share, but you want to listen in, you're certainly welcome to do so. So Saturday, November 7th at 10 a.m. We have a couple things coming up in December. First off, the Gingerbread Festival is still happening. We are limiting the festival to one day from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Saturday, December 5th. The rain/snow date would be the Sunday, December 6th. It's going to be from, again, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. If you're interested in creating a gingerbread house or gingerbread creation, we do have the link on our website under the upcoming programs, and we are limiting entries to 25 total, just so we can space them out with proper social distancing. So for more information, check out our website there. And then I'm excited to announce we have a brand new holiday program called the Wonderland of Wreaths, and it's going to be an exhibit/fundraiser. There are going to be 25 wreaths that local businesses, individuals, and museum members have decorated. They're all unique. Two of them actually are going to be made from Marblehead handprints fabric. Yay. And so that's going to be happening December 1st through December 12th. They'll be on view at the museum. And there's also going to be an online silent auction. So check out our website for more information for that programming. And without further ado, as I admit more people, I want to first thank Marble Harbor Investment for sponsoring our lecture series for 2020. And let's tell you a little bit more about Judy Anderson. Judy came to Marblehead over 25 years ago because of its rare and early architecture. And for more than a quarter of a century, she has been devoted to advocacy and education about Marblehead's dynamic, compelling, and important social, cultural, and architectural history. Before coming to Marblehead, she worked in art museums in Los Angeles for 10 years and had completed graduate coursework in art history at the University of Southern California. She then worked in the education department of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston before starting her 16 years of professional work with the Lee Mansion in 1993. For the past several years, as the principal of an educational mission called Marblehead Architecture Heritage, Judy has enjoyed partnering with several organizations in town, mainly pro bono, for special illustrated programs and tours. She has offered periodic walking tours and outdoor presentations as Marblehead Architecture and Heritage Tours. Most of those have been part of regional initiatives or local events and celebrations, especially during local historical anniversaries, and have usually benefited the relevant nonprofit organizations, such as us tonight. We are happy to have her tell us the 375 years of history at Fort Sewall. And without further ado, Judy, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. And thank you all for showing up. Wow, that's really quite impressive. I know we all would really rather be up at the fort, maybe not tonight, but sometime. So I hope you'll enjoy this presentation about what the fort's all about. There's so much dynamic history there. And I have a lot of slides. We're gonna go through them very fast. And I'm more than happy to answer questions at the end. And I hope you'll enjoy really kind of getting a sense of the context for the fort. I'm not a historical researcher as much as I'm really can communicate the history. And I've already realized that I have a mistake on my very first slide, where this wonderful, wonderful plan that was drawn of Fort Sewall in around 1820. It has annotations on it from 1861 and the signature down there from the engineer department, Captain Blunt, and that beautiful handwriting. Well, I thought that the rocks around Fort Sewall were also added around the plan, rather, just in this plan drawing. But actually those rocks were drawn in 1820 as well. So it's a really cool plan that shows the fort as we know it today. But there's a lot more to that fort than meets the eye. So I hope that with these, trying to convey something that doesn't exist anymore visually, I hope you kind of get the flavor of it as we go through this talk tonight. So enjoy. First of all, we all know where Fort Sewall is, and we are all really excited to get back there next year. I'll update you a little bit on what's going on up there as well. But here's a great overview of it from Google Earth. And this year, or last year rather, was the fort's 375th anniversary. The fort was established in 1644. So it's kind of exciting that we're doing this big accessibility project that's still ongoing this year, as we did the fundraising for it last year. So the fort was constructed on Maverick's Head. Well, we all know that as Gale's Head, right? But Ambrose Gale bought it from Moses Maverick in 1674. And Moses Maverick had daughters. So his name didn't get onto anything because he didn't have any progeny with his name. And it's sad because he's an awesome guy and our town wouldn't exist without him, but that's a topic of another talk. So this was Maverick's Head first when the fort was constructed, and then it was Gale's Head. So we can call it both. The fort was also not called Fort Sewall until about 1800. That year, a very prominent, wonderful person in Marblehead named Samuel Sewall, who was born in 1757. So before the Revolution, he was a teenager in the Revolution. He became a congressman and in the Massachusetts state, as well as the United States Congress. And then he was appointed a justice, an associate justice in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 1800. And that was pretty exciting. And so the fort was named after him. That was after Elbridge Gerry became a governor in 1810. It wasn't called Fort Gerry. It was actually before also Joseph Story became. So we'll touch on those later. But for some reason, he was chosen in around 1800. The fort seems to have gotten the name Fort Sewall, and it certainly was named after him. And he was Chief Justice in 1814 during the War of 1812. And he unfortunately died that year as well, up in Maine, which was part of Massachusetts then. He was holding a court there. So the fort we see right there and that we know so well, that's the fort that was brand new when he was a justice. That part of the fort was built somewhere around 1800 to 1808, maybe 10, but around that time. So that's Fort Sewall as we know it today. And here it is renovated, actually. There's what it used to look like last year, and here's what it looks like this year. These were officers' quarters. And the fort is, as you know, at the very tip of the Marblehead Peninsula, on the northeast tip, we should say. It's not on the northwest tip, it's on the northeast of the mainland peninsula on that headland that juts out, and it's a perfect spot for a fort. I'm going to show you a lot of maps in this program. I love the maps because I love getting oriented, and this is one of my favorite ones. It's in Abbott Hall. It's in the Marblehead Historical Commission's collection. It's behind glass, so I couldn't get a good photo of it, but it's by Marion Martin Brown. And I think I added an E. She probably didn't have an E at the end of her name. So at any rate, it's a sweet little map. But what I love about it especially is it shows all the points of interest, but it also shows the extent of the town when Marblehead was at its peak, which was right before the American Revolution. So that was Marblehead, all crammed into basically Precinct 1 and a little bit of Precinct 2, right before the Revolution at its peak of its prosperity. So love this map. And there's the fort, of course, right at the end. This is another map that I love. It's up in Abbott Hall, and it was painted during the WPA program in the 1930s. This particular one was 1934 to 35, roughly. A lot of the murals in Marblehead in Abbott Hall were painted around that time by Arthur Kelly and T.S. Baker. But I love this map of Marblehead, and it too sort of shows the extent of the town in its heyday, and it didn't extend farther until much later. That's where the map lives. That's where the mural is, in the hallway of Abbott Hall with our COVID arrows on it now. But sometime make a point to look up when you go into Abbott Hall. It's worth a whole tour to have a tour of the WPA murals. There's also a cannonball in there that it says might be from the fort. Well, there were a lot of boats in the water and over the centuries, and a lot of them carried cannons for defensive, protective purposes. So who knows where that cannonball's from, but the label says it could be from the fort. So who knows? But here's Google Maps, the Marblehead Peninsula with Google Maps. There's the Marblehead Fort in that very pronounced headland. This was Little Harbor. This was the harbor. We're familiar with the big harbor, but throughout the 1600s, when you talked about Marblehead Harbor, this was Marblehead Harbor. It's the Little Harbor. It was it had sheltered coves. It was great for the boats to shelter and be safe riding for vessels, as they said in the 1630s. So that's Marblehead Harbor. Now we call it the Little Harbor. And the town itself developed down the big harbor as the 1700s approached. So here's that headland with the rocky shoreline that protects it. It's a perfect spot for a fort. And there's the fort from above. These are great pictures by Rick Ashley. Thank you very much, Rick, for sharing those. And the fort as we know it, I'm going to try and kind of give you a sense of what we know it this way, but I'm going to try and give you tonight a sense of what it was in the past, right down there at the very end, at the bottom of your screen, where that U shape is. That was sort of the early fort, the U shape of the benches. So you can see how it's almost like an arrow jutting out there into the little harbor. And that's where the old original fort had been on Gale's Head or Maverick's Head. There it is from the shore, the harbor side drone view, drone in the sky, whoever that is. Thank you. I'm borrowing your photographs. But you can see it doesn't even need ramparts or walls. They're already built as we go around. So what are those ramparts? They were for protective purposes, because enemy vessels coming in would come from where all the Halifax race and all the sailors come in now. But that's where the enemy vessels would come in, and the fort was a perfect spot for that. That's what the vessels would see. That's the headland as you approach it from the water. There it is again. So they didn't need to build ramparts. If you didn't have that kind of topography, this is what you might build. If you're down in the flatter zones of Virginia, you'd have to build some protection, but we didn't need to do that in Marblehead. So that topography that I was talking about in that map, on the plan rather, from the 1820s, that literally accurately illustrated the rocks that are around that fort. They're part of the fort structure. And these are some of the schooners. Just wanted to throw those in. This is in the Marblehead Museum's collection. It's a wonderful fireboard to cover up your fireplace in the winter when you're tired of looking at the fireplace. And finally we get spring. But these are a wonderful illustration of schooners. This is from about 1801. So that's what would have populated Marblehead Harbor. Inside, you didn't want those big enemy vessels coming in. And you had some brigs coming in sometimes too, but this scene is looking across at Marblehead Neck before there were trees and houses. Now, Marblehead Harbor and the fort are all about recreation, and it's spectacular. And in COVID times, boy, have we been happy to have a place to walk in Marblehead, but rats, the fort was closed. So it was nice to have it in the spring. It'll be back, and it'll be even better because everybody can be able to walk to it. So the fort that we all know and love is a recreational space. Everybody loves the fort. There are about 50,000 visits per year. I realized I didn't have a picture of a dog walker, but that's what you usually get at the fort. And wow, remember those days? There's the Culinary Arts Festival. So the fort is a place of many happy memories for people and happy activities and its spectacular beauty. It's also Glover's Regiment, of course. And a lot of us have been to the wonderful encampment the weekend after 4th of July for the British and the rebels. We call them patriots, but they would have been called rebels at the time. And this has brought the fort alive with its heritage and its history in a tangible way that people can really experience as opposed to just watch. So these gatherings are vital in our fort, and we're all looking forward to it again. So keeping the fort's heritage alive has been a huge role for Glover's Regiment. And when the fort is reopened again, we're going to hopefully have a reproduction cannon out there. So that's going to be really fun to have that as well. At this 375th anniversary time, there's a lot going on at the fort. We all remember and loved that tree. But we're going to get some accessible ramps, which will make up for that, I hope. The project has been managed by the town's Fort Sewall Oversight Committee, and the structural preservation has been completed. We ran into granite. Granite is by nature hard, and so that took a little bit of time to deal with, perhaps more than we thought. But Chairman Larry Sands has led the regiment in the past. Seamus Daly is doing it now at the moment for the last several years, maybe 10 years almost. And Larry's has been leading the Fort Sewall Oversight Committee so ably. He's such a great spokesperson for the fort for 20 years. And these are some images of what the voter approved voting and tax override are providing for us. And there's some of the granite that they ran into if you haven't seen it on MHTV's videos. So it's a lot of work that's been done, but we're going to be glad that it's finished when it's finished. There's some before and afters real quick of the preservation that was funded by the Massachusetts Historical Commission. The project's been overseen by McGinley Calso Associates and the Fort Sewall Committee. There's a before and after, new doors. And one of the things that we're excited about is that when the fort is finished, we're going to be able to go inside. People are going to be able to go inside much more often than they have in the past. These were officers' meeting rooms, maybe some galleys, but underneath these mounds were bomb-proof quarters, basically, for storage of gunpowder and ammunition and so forth. So that if it exploded, nobody would get hurt. And that's about the extent of my technical knowledge about forts. But there are some interesting inside passages in there, and we'll be able to go inside those much more often because of some private fundraising that's been done over the course of the past couple of years. And Charles Gessner has been awesome to spearhead that, and Judy Jacoby also. Very generous people are making it possible to have a maintenance endowment for ongoing maintenance, and to get inside these chambers with some docent programs. So these are some of what's been accomplished up there already. What we're in the process of doing is a lot of the preservation work is done that has been funded by the Massachusetts Historical Commission, the Preservation Projects Fund. So there's the completed masonry restoration. So a lot has been accomplished. The benches are almost ready to go back. They were all removed, and an Eagle Scout named Liam Conley has been coordinating the effort to repair all 35 of the benches and refurbish them. Awesome job that he is doing. What a terrific guy, and a huge process and a huge money saver as well for the project. There will also be a fund for ongoing maintenance from that extra fundraising, the private fundraising, in case something like this happens again, or whatever else. There'll be lots of fundraising. And as I said, we're really looking forward to being able to get inside those rooms instead of just looking through the bars through a seasonal Fort Ranger docent program. So if anybody is interested in donating, the donation are still possible through the end of this year. Those are the categories on the screen. But some of the best thanks go to the donors who've already donated, the future donors by December, and the 15,718 voters in Marblehead who've made this all possible. So thank you. And anybody over $20 or more will be listed in a Fort Sewall booklet that we'll be publishing for 2022. And that will celebrate the fort's 100th anniversary of ownership by the town of Marblehead. So hopefully COVID will be behind us. We can have a gathering in the fort, just like they gathered in 1922 to celebrate the fact that they celebrate when the fort was officially turned over to the town of Marblehead from the US government that year. So maybe it'll look like this in 2022 again. We'll see what happens. In honor of the fort's 375th anniversary, some artistry has happened. Hestia Creations, the theme of their annual plate is the fort this year, which is fantastic. and their ornament. So this is an announcement basically for their ornament. They announced it in the newspaper and online a couple days ago, or yesterday or today. But here it is, a preview of their 2020 ornament. They've got everything in there. They've got everything we love: dog walker on a leash, walkers, the fort, the tents, cannon, because everyone loves cannons, USS Constitution, and the light tower, and the tree. So it's all there. Hope you can find your way to Hestia Products and Hawk Street off Atlantic Avenue and get yourselves an 2020 ornament, and also a 375th anniversary Marblehead Mini from the captain's quarters celebrated Fort Sewall. So there are a lot of artists in Marblehead who cherish the town's history and create items that celebrate Marblehead's historic places and evoke memories of the people who purchased them, for the people who purchased them. And that's the goal of Captain's Quarters with these little minis. So she also did a 370, Carol Eldridge also did a 375 anniversary. And the fort right there, this awesome picture by Isle Oren and Wednesday in Marblehead. It's the calendar cover for this year. So the fort is a big deal this year. So let's go back in time a little bit. Here's the little harbor from above. And there is an 1850 map of Fort Sewall taking up about half of that section of the front. The islands in the little harbor were Mavericks Island in the 1630s, the Great Island, which is now Crown and Shield Island, but most of us know it as Brown's Island. But actually, I'm going to jump ahead because the Crown and Shields owned that island. The Great Island was always owned by two groups of people. For the longest time, it was the Browns, but before that, it was a lot of other people or several other people. And it all got consolidated to one ownership by the Crown and Shields in 1918, the year of the pandemic, of all things. So it was the Crown and Shields for a long time until it was donated in 1955 by Louise DuPont Crown and Shield. There's a whole ownership history of the islands, which I'm not going to go into, but it's on the screen. If this goes online sometime in YouTube, people can stop it on the screen and check it out and see who owned what. But those are some of the owners that I'm not going to take time to go into. But that 1918 is when the island was owned by one person. But both of those islands have always been owned privately. And now they're both owned by the Trustees of Reservations, which is a land trust, since the donation of Mavericks Island, which became Reefs Island, which became Gary's Island, by Ted Moore and his wife, Julie, just a couple of years ago, which is great. So the settlement of Marblehead around Little Harbor was all in this end of the peninsula for most of the 1600s. The fort's built in 1644, and it was outfitted with 2 cannon to begin with in 1644, with convenient ammunition, and substantial works were erected that year in 1644. So that's how we get the early date. That's probably what the cannon looked like. That's an 18-pounder. That means the size of the ball, the weight of the ball. And all the cannons, no matter what their size is, they all pretty much look alike. So it's really hard to tell between them. But the town itself was then settled before the fort was built, of course. But the fort was built in 1644 before Marblehead was its own independent town. So Marblehead was a town in 1649, 5 years after the fort was built. And in 1639, when this map was made, Marblehead was called Marble Harbor, so very briefly. But even before that, in 1630, there was a official fortification out at Nogg's Head, or what had been called Nog's Head, apparently. And it's shown on this 1875 map. You can see the knob of land out there. But that was really part of Salem Harbor. And you can see Nogg's Head right in the bottom right. And then Fort Pickering, which had been called the Salem Fort originally on Winter Island. You can see where those 2 forts were very important to guard the entrance into Salem Harbor. And Salem was, of course, a much more developed town in the 1600s than Marblehead was. So the fort at Nogg's Head, which later became called Fort Darby, that was an important spot for guarding the entrance to this very important harbor. Marblehead's Fort Sewall is just a little bit later. So there you've got the progression of dates of when Salem began in 1626, then Marblehead 1629, Nogg's Head fortified right after that, fortification at Salem, which became Fort Pickering in 1637, Marblehead 1644, and our fort at Gales Head or Maverick's Head, and then a town in 1649. So Salem Fort's on Winter Island, for those of you who don't know. Okay, there's Fort Pickering now. Just threw in a couple of pictures of that real quick, just as comparison to our fort. So again, now I'm going to go back and talk about a little bit of some of the other fortifications around Marblehead besides Naugus Head and Fort Darby, which is over there at 11 o'clock, so to speak. As you come around clockwise on the peninsula, you get Bailey's Head or Fort Bailey, which in the War of 1812 became Fort Washington, Skinner's Head, Gilbert's Heights, and Hewitt's Head. Now here's another map that shows the extent of the developed town in relation to those fortifications. Those are basically gun batteries. We're not talking about construction. It's pretty much a gun battery for the most part, and maybe some planking and palisade around it to protect it. But during the War of 1812, there were even more added. The little blue crosses are War of 1812 forts that were added to all these fortified areas that were up on high headlands. Here's the Naugus Head area as it looked in 1700. That fort was still out there one way or the other, but it was never really super developed because by that time we had Fort Sewall and you didn't have to worry about Naugus Head as much. And it had been a Native American fortification as well back in the day. So again, here are the locations. There's the Marblehead Harbor with the locations of all those headlands. There's Bartol's Head and Goodwin's Head, which had a gun battery on it. Goodwin's Head did. Skinner's Head, where the Rockmere Hotel was built, and now it's Glover Landing. During the War of 1812, and this is on the Marblehead Museum's website, there was a 42-pound cannon on Skinner's Head during that time. That's huge. That's one big gun, which could probably shoot down the harbor. These are Hewitt's Head and Gilbert's Heights. That's down at the end of the end of the harbor. That's Gilbert's Heights and Hewitt's Head, looking a lot different than they did when they were gun batteries, that's for sure. But here's Fort Bailey across from Fort Sewall, and it's a really important spot. It's even mapped out as a fort on that drawing, so there might have been some sort of construction there. This is who it's named after, Captain John Bailey, and this is an awesome pastel portrait of Bailey from the 1790s. He was commander of all the Marblehead fortifications in the War of 1812. He was in his 50s. He retired from a lot of trading in France and privateering when he was a teenager. And that was Bailey's Head right there. But Bailey's Head looked across the harbor to the fort. So the black and white or brown and white, you're looking at the headland of the fort from Bailey's Head, from what's now Fountain Park. And then the pictures up above, one's looking out onto the fort on the right, and then from a kayak looking up to Fountain Park on the left. And there's that view. So there would have been a cannon base here shooting across, and there would have been cannons facing this way from the fort, covering that cove, because that's a really important cove. There's the rocky headland, sorry about that. And the cove is important because if an invading enemy was going to invade Marblehead, the longboats would be unloaded from the big boat, and this is the landing spot. So that was a very strategic area at that point. Now it's Gas House Beach and we all love it, but that was a strategic point in the past. So Bailey's Head was an important one. So again, there's Bailey's Head and Gales Head kind of facing each other, if you can imagine that. And there's the arrow pointing to Bailey's Head and the fort, the Fort Peninsula. So that kind of covers, there are lots of trees here now. Of course, there wouldn't have been trees then. And now you can't even see out of Fountain Park. The trees are so tall. So here are those rocks that this 1820 map mapped out so carefully. These are the palisades of a fort that would otherwise have to be built. They're the defensive palisades. You can defend them. They're protective. And we didn't have to build anything. So the fort only had to be an earthwork fort to really be fairly effective. If you didn't have that, this is what you would build instead. You would dig a trench, and all the rubble that on the right, all the rubble that was from the trench would go into a structure that was tall that you could kind of hide behind And there's a lot of terminology that I'm not really up to speed on, redoubts and ramparts and all that kind of thing. But I think pictures tell a good story. And this is from a plan of Bunker Hill, actually, drawn by English engineer John Montresor in 1775 after the English took Bunker and Breed's Hills. But you can get a sense of when we have that promenade of our fort, we're walking along those ramparts of the defensive part of the fort. They offer spectacular views now and wonderful benches, but that's what those hillsides are that we walk our dogs on. And there's the plan that I was talking about by Montresor. There's about Bunker Hill, and he then fleshed out, and Breed's Hill, and he fleshed out the structures in that little drawing down there. So here's Marblehead's Fort Sewall again, that 1820 plan, which reflected the renovations, major renovations between 1794 and 1801 and 1808. It was a very difficult time, which I'm hoping I'll have time to get into more. The structures are shown in elevation and in plan, shown by the arrows there. So it's very precise, and there's a stamp of the United States engineers. So these are professional military engineers who are doing these, who are creating these. They also drew the ramparts and the elevations, and very carefully mapped all of that out. So these are professional guys who would be doing CAD drawings now if they had that capability, but they had different capabilities. And now you can get a sense, I hope, of the structure of the fort, of its ramparts and its protective areas, comparing these drawings to the fort structure as it is. Okay, so a lot of these drawings have been discovered and found and researched by this researcher whose name is Rick Detwiller, Frederick Detwiller. But Rick was first hired by the town in 1975, 50 years ago, for the US Bicentennial to do a history of the fort. And now, 50 years later, he's been hired again to really dig into some areas that we wanted to know a little bit more about. So he's been writing and emailing, and in the middle of COVID trying to do this. We started the project in the beginning of March, and then everything shut down, of course. So last year for the 375th anniversary, I wrote a few grants to cover this, the research cost. And I think he's working for about 25 cents an hour at this point, or maybe a dime, but because he's very enthusiastic about it, which is wonderful. And we're definitely excited to have these reports. It's like the Bob Booth reports for the houses. These reports are so valuable for Marblehead. And we're very grateful to the Massachusetts Society of Colonial Wars, who have also helped the Lee Mansion over quite a few years. Thank you very much to all of those, and the General Society of Colonial Wars, and also the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, who have contributed to this project, the research. But this couple of years ago, 10 years ago, they funded this monument to General John Glover. And their mission is Revolutionary War officers. So it was a very good fit. And the Society of Colonial Wars, they are interested in the conflicts and conflict resolution that happened before the revolution, because we kind of forget about those. So both of these organizations are terrific to help keep memories and knowledge alive and disseminate it. So we're very grateful. So I mentioned that there were all these professional engineers doing drawings. These forts are not just thrown together. And later on, if you want to go to the list, this is a list of all the engineers and when they were hired by the Crown or the US government or the Army in the various conflicts that America participated in. There were about 7 different wars and 7 different renovations for this fort during those wars. So these are the list of names of the engineers. But here's one of the field manuals that engineers would have. And this, remember I mentioned John Montresor, this is he in a portrait by John Singleton Copley that's in the Detroit Institute of Art. And look at that book that's in his hand. That's the book that's shown in the picture. He's got the field guide there, the field engineer in his portrait, just like shipping magnates had their ships painted in the background of their portraits. So that's a face that we can put on one of the engineers, which is very rare. And here's this wooden framework that you see in elevation on the left, and you've been looking at countless times now at this point on the Fort Sewall plan, that's what that is basically. These long, this planking, as it were, is a platform for guns. And so here's an elevation of what one could look like. We don't know if that's what this one looked like. And for the renovation that's going to be happening, and certainly when we get up there again next spring, we're going to see a reproduction or a suggestion of one of those gun decks out at the end of Fort Sewall. So that's going to be pretty exciting to get a sense of that spot as a fort, not just as a beautiful place to walk around. So that's a 3-pounder cannon, kind of small, kind of a ship size, but they would have reinforced potentially the fort, the bigger cannons with ship's cannons at times of stress, who knows. So this plan was from 1705 by Colonel Wolfgang Wilhelm Romer. And he was knocked off the job for swearing and being so cantankerous and probably messing with the people. And so Colonel John Redknapp took over from him. So they both worked on this plan. But you can see here Marblehead from the province of Massachusetts Bay in America, longitude 4334. And he's got the key that's up in the upper right. I made it larger in the lower left. So these are the plans that they would draw. And this is for the Marblehead Fort. Here's the sally port, the doorway, and the guardhouse and a sentry box and a vault arched over to keep their powder. And at the bottom, an old fishing house. There you go. So I think this is very exciting from 1705. And this is a little schematic drawing of it that Rick did back in 1975 for the report that was done for the town. So that's kind of the orientation of the fort plan as it would have been on Gale's Head, right there at the end. Rick's going to do this electronically. It's going to be much better than what I'm showing you here. But there's also this illustration of the cannon. So he's fleshing out how the cannons worked and how they fit into the fort here in Marblehead. There were 12 of them in 1700. That's quite a lot when you think about it. Here's a fort in various stages of activity. The frontispiece of a treatise of artillery book. Here's a field cannon at Colonial Williamsburg. They're kind of small for their frameworks, of course, and sometimes they exploded and killed people. Sometimes that happened for a fancy salute and it exploded and killed the people standing around it, which is really unfortunate, especially the iron ones. They got better when they were bronze. So these are some illustrations of cannons. They're all about 5 or 6 feet or maybe 4 feet, no matter what the ball size is. Smaller, of course, with a 6-pound ball, but not a lot of difference. And I think that 24 is supposed to be a 32. I think that's a mistake that I made. Here's ship's cannons, the pieces, the different parts of the cannons. And this one was captured from a privateer, an English privateer, and it's in Georgetown, Massachusetts now. And these are some big guns. This is in Croatia. This is not what we had in America, but this is what the Marblehead Fort might have had. This is in Nova Scotia, at a fort in Nova Scotia, at Fort Anne, which is Queen Anne. And this is what our fort arrangement might have looked like. So Marblehead was thriving in the 1760s, and we had that protection of the fort. And the fort was all about the fishing and protecting this very valuable harbor, which was a moneymaker for Marblehead and for Massachusetts Bay. So this was a major operation of fishing. We needed protection, and gentlemen in Marblehead, businessmen, merchants, were often petitioning, come on, the fort's all worn out again. We really need to reinforce the fort. And it was all about the Atlantic, because the Atlantic is a highway, and that's what we needed protection from. And because the danger comes from the highway there. And there were forts all up and down the seaboard, Nova Scotia down. And who were the enemy? Well, for a while, it was the Dutch in the 1600s, the French and the Dutch. But there were a series of 4 wars against the Dutch and the English versus the Dutch. Most of the 1700s, it was the French, except for, remember when they helped us in the Revolution? Well, that was partially to get back at England, because England and France are always having these rolling wars for centuries. So that was useful to them to strike a blow at England. And 10 years later, we were almost at war with France in the 1790s. And it was all about trade. So all of that happened out on the highway. And that's why the coastal forts were so important. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to go through a beginning to end of the fort to give you an idea, not so much about the fort, which I've just done, but about Marblehead and what was happening and going on and what in Marblehead as those developments took place. And what did people look like? What was happening? So here's the 1620s, maybe seasonal fishing. And there's a shallop here and what people would have looked like in the 1620s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And we were settled in 1629. I'd love to have a portrait of Moses Maverick, our town founder, but there is none. And as I said, he has daughters, so he had no progeny. But these are what people at that time in the 1600s, when that fort was being built, might have looked like. Some of these are from Plymouth Plantation, others are from paintings, but it gives you a sense of what the Marbleheaders would have looked like at that time, whether you were just a regular guy or an adventurer or a military guy who was exploring. This is an interesting family. There's a lot to unpack in that portrait, but that would have been a family who's much more comfortable, who obviously had a child die. Almost everybody had one or two or three or four or five children who died. But these are some of the rough and tumble Marbleheaders that would have been walking our streets, the same streets that we walk. And I love these. I love being able to, well, these are more like Marbleheaders of some that frequented the taverns maybe. But I love being able to see what these people might have looked like as they were living in these very rudimentary houses in the beginning. They're regular folks like us. They just wore different clothes and the hygiene was different and the plumbing was pretty bad. So these are the interiors that you can go to other places to see. Pioneer Village is one of them. Plymouth Plantation is one. This is about as good as it got in the 1600s. And we've got a couple of houses that look like that here in Marblehead. But the interiors are what we can't get a flavor for unless you go someplace like to Plymouth. But this little house on Wadden Court is one of the most important houses in Marblehead in my mind. It would have looked like this one on the right in Watertown, a historic New England property. Some of the fancier houses would have been this one at the left on Franklin Street, or like these in Portsmouth. Those are gone now in Marblehead. We don't have anything like that, but you can see them in some other places. So this is the 1600s. This is what houses would have looked like. This is into this turn of the 1700s with a little overhang, mimicking what some of these other fancier houses had, just going back for a minute. But here it is on this itty bitty one room over one room house. And then there were fancier houses as well. The ones in France, one of these is in France and one of these was in Boston. But again, going back to the ocean, that's where the problems were. And these three Anglo-Dutch wars in the 1600s were just one after the other from 1650 to 1674. And then there was a fourth one way later, pretty much at the end of our revolution. But they spilled over. And not only did we have to refurbish the fort in 1644, but in 1666, our guys went back and said, we need some more. So the general court gave us 2 or 3 guns, 2,500 feet of boards, 100 feet of planking, 1,000 feet of planking. We got a tax abatement because of that, and we built our fort, or we reinforced our fort. Then right after that, Native American wars happened, and the fort was, quote, put in order with 3 great guns, great spelled that way. That was a pretty difficult war with the Native Americans. We were invading their space. They were not happy about that. And it's very complicated and very important to understand what was going on as this machine rolled across the continent starting in the 1600s, basically. But these were some of the later 1600s rulers that were involved in that, the Native American, the English, and his governor, the king in England, and then his governor here in New England over on the top right, whom everybody pretty much hated. They finally deposed the guy in the middle, and so they got rid of the guy on the right, and we got these two. This was the daughter of the guy in the middle, the king, and they said, okay, you can come back and reign, but you got to bring your husband, and he's king, and you're there. So that's William and Mary, if you've heard that term. But during that time, there's a 9-year war, King William's War in the 1600s. And that's why Marblehead became such a backwater, because they couldn't fish because the war is out on the Atlantic. Marblehead was pretty thriving in the early part of the 1600s as it was building itself, not like Salem, but it was going, and we built the codfish aristocracy for Salem and Boston. But there's this war. So in the late 1600s, we didn't do very well. New form of government, new laws. And 1691, that was a really tough time. New Englanders felt threatened. And what happened in 1692? The witchcraft trials. So when the queen dies in 1694, the king in 1702, excuse me, take a drink. And her sister rules in her own right, not through her husband, Queen Anne. She got short shrift in history. But when she was ruling, this was Marblehead. She ruled for 14 years, and for 11 of those years, there was a big war, and it impacted Marblehead dramatically. She had about 14 miscarriages or children who died. And one, finally, she had a son, Duke of Gloucester. If you've been to Colonial Williamsburg, they named a street after him, but then he died too when he was 11. So her war was all about who's succeeding who in England, in Europe. But we get tangled up in these because France is here in the Canada area, England is here on the coast, and it's conflict. So that's why this fort was built during her reign. Here's Fort William and Mary up in near Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Excuse me. And it's all about the fishing banks. And at the end of Queen Anne's War, Marblehead turned a big corner after that war with a treaty that opened up this grand bank to New England fishing for the first time, because all the other banks had been fished out by that time. So Queen Anne's War really gave Marblehead its prosperity. Churches were built, meeting houses were built, townhouse was built, schooners are going out and sailing. There's the English flag. We're thriving through international fishing and international trade. The Samuel Trevitt House is an example of that. Here's a representative of the merchants in the 1730s and 40s. These are not Marblehead people, but it's what they would have looked like. Making business deals over rum and punch. 1737, still thriving. One of our ministers goes to Harvard to be the president, just 10 years after the townhouse is built. And then presto, another war again. Jeepers. That's a trade monopoly war. It's very confusing. And it was all about Spain and fish. So it really impacted Marblehead. You can look at this sometime if you want afterward. But we had to reinforce the fort again. And these are some of the gentlemen who were involved in those negotiations. This is the son of one of them, Thomas Gary, and he's a guy that we don't hear about much, but he was an important player in Marblehead. Not many kids look like this in Marblehead. Most of them look like this. So 1740s is a tough time after the thriving teens, 20s and 30s. And so the fort had to be renovated again. And that's where we get the whole story of the Agnes Surriage story, which some people have heard about, some people haven't now. Used to be everybody knew what that was. And I am going to refer you to a book called Marblehead's Pygmalion to learn more about that, because Fred Marshall Bauer in Marblehead wrote a book to try and figure out what was truth and what was myth. But the Fountain Inn was right up there at that location that I talked to you about Fountain Park. There was the Fountain Inn. That's why Fountain Park is named that. And the Fountain Inn was right where that house with the windows is, those two houses over on the right. And Agnes was a fisherman's daughter who apparently caught the eye of the supervisor of the fort renovations. And she became his ward, which is a euphemism. And then he finally did marry her back in England, but it took him like a decade before he finally did. So the fort was renovated in the 1740s in a big way. Our sign at the fort used to say it was built in 1742, but not so. That was King George's War. A lot of people think that was the French and Indian War. Nope. That was King George's War after King William's War and after Queen Anne's War. So we had military engineers involved in that war and merchants trying to figure it all out. This is the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, 1754 to 63. This is when Marblehead's powder house was built way out of town so nothing would explode in town. and Major Jacob Fowle in an awesome Copley portrait there, and Colonel Jeremiah Lee and 2 others were involved in building that. These are their houses at that time where they lived, Jeremiah Lee and Jacob Fowle, right there on Washington Street, and the so-called Lafayette House that had a doorway there. That was a shop back then. And Lee was colonel of the Marblehead Militia at that time, and so was Jacob Fowle. So the militia was a defensive militia, again, about all this very prosperous fishing community. And by the 1760s, Marblehead was the 10th most populous metropolis in British North America, bigger than Salem by 700 people, which is a lot. That's the entire population of Lexington. So Marblehead is a thriving, going concern all through these times. We really were a boom town from 1713 on up until 1775. Homes were built in the 1750s and 60s, especially the 60s, and the gigantic, gorgeous ones here that you can still see the insides of, and Jeremiah Lee and the other major employer in town, Robert King Hooper, King in quotes. Between them, they had 5 houses. But the French were still out there on our back door, and the 1700s was a series of conflicts between England and France, and England and France, and England and France. And the ship Lively was prowling around our harbor because we were starting to get rebellious. And she would have faced 18 cannons on Fort Sewall in 1775. This is what the Lively would have seen in Isle Oran's photograph again. And at one point in November 26, 1775, she threatened, the Lively's captain, he threatened to burn the town of Marblehead because we were so rebellious. And we were concerned about that because he had already done that, or another admiral or captain had already done that, a commodore of a flotilla, had already done that in Falmouth, Maine. So Marblehead had good reason to fear. Rick Detwiller, the researcher, is thinking that maybe Washington might have come to explore our ramparts. We don't know, because Ashley Bowen wrote in a little bit of a cryptic way, because it was probably a lot of rumor and fake news and alternative facts and that sort of thing. The grandees came to examine our fort again, General Lee, etc. So we don't know if Washington was here in 1775 or not. Maybe, maybe not. Charles Lee, General Charles Lee, was second in command of the engineers. And between 1,200 and 1,500 Marblehead men and boys served in the Revolution. That was a huge proportion of the population when the town had about 1,000 families. And the fort was manned, as you can see it in J. Frost's painting there at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation down in the lower left. There's the fort with the cannons, and J.O.J. telling that story again that he was so good at. But the Marblehead Regiment was a real thing, and I don't have time to talk about that, but it was a lot of men and boys who sacrificed a huge amount partially because they were all unemployed, because the fishing banks had been closed to New England fishing in March 1775 as an economic sanction. So everybody knew the writing was on the wall and they wouldn't have any work. So better to be free and independent. So General John Glover was in command after Jeremiah Lee died. And some of you might know that today is John Glover's birthday. He was born the same year that George Washington was. We know the story of the regiment, and they all stood up in the boats. They were big barges. But after enlistments were up, and even before that, after enlistments were up December 31st, 1776, and before that in autumn, a lot of people from Marblehead went out privateering because A, you could get paid, and B, they were really good at it. And you could make a little bit of a profit. Not a lot, but better than being in the infantry. So there were some really important guys who did a lot of service to the quest for freedom, a lot of which took place at sea by crippling sea traffic. Our fort was very important to that venture. So these are some of the people involved in that, which you can go back and watch the video to learn a little bit more about this. The Appeal to Heaven flag, Captain Manley was a Commodore. Captain James Mugford was a hero of the Hope. They both captured supply ships, both guys out of Marblehead. To hear what the women would have been looking like at home. And this is, again, the people who would have populated Marblehead when all of those national things were happening, national events. These are regular folks who would have been dressed in ways that are, pretty casual, not what we see in the Copley portraits. These would have been Marblehead people. After the war, there were a lot of prisoners, and many POWs died in captivity. John Glover's son, John Sr. might have died in captivity, or this might have been Jonathan Glover's son. We're not quite sure who, but it's a beautiful portrait. It's a miniature portrait, and both of them died, so could have had a portrait painted. 1790 was the first US Census. Marblehead's population was almost 6,000. We used to be 5,000 when we were the 10th largest. We were still tied for 10th in 1790. Who knew? But at that point, after the revolution, the town was generally poor. And what I like about this portrait, this image, is the fort palisade down there, which you can see. It's a view from the fort out to the town across Fort Beach. Really fantastic view. Here are some more maps. 1795, the first official commissioned map, 6 years after Washington was inaugurated. And 2 years later, we're starting to build frigates because we think we're going to go to war with France. So that was when the Constitution was built. It's about trade. It's always about business. It's always about the economy. And the fort had another major renovation, 1794 to 1801. And Rick Betweller, the researcher, can talk a lot more about these plans, but they all exist for the fort. And then this one in 1820 documents what was done then. And here Rick has annotated them for his 1975 report, which is available online to look at if you want to. And again, that's where that footprint was. This undeclared war with France was 1798 to 1801, with hostilities and tensions on either side of those dates. Samuel Sewall was Chief Justice right at that time, that very difficult time. Joseph Story of Marblehead was an Associate Justice of the National Supreme Court until he was 1845 when he died. So those are images of him. What a wise face that is. So Marblehead is really a going concern all through this time. And here's the gun house that was built. Again, same reason for the powder house. We were concerned and needed a place to store powder out of town beyond just what was in the fort. Here's the map of the country at that point. France still owns a lot of territory until 1804. Spain has the whole West Coast, and the Native Americans are trying to hang in there and have a hard time all through the 1800s. But the War of 1812 is again against England and America and the United States. It was our second war of independence, basically. It ended in a draw, so to speak. It was fought mostly at sea. It was messy, as all wars can be. But again, more than 1,000 men and boys served from 1,000 families, mostly at sea, and half of them were POWs when the war was over. But that war was that was the fort's greatest moment, was the War of 1812, Sunday, April 3rd in 1814, when the Constitution took refuge in Marblehead Harbor, being chased by 2 warships. She paid a repeat visit in 1931 and again in 1997 for her 200th birthday. So that was a big deal for the Marblehead Fort. And you've met John Bailey here before, but he was the commander of the fort at that time and of all those other fortifications. What's that hat about? Awesome French hat. Here you go. This is what sharpshooters, the Marines, and the not the working class guys would have dressed like. Here's some nice, comfortable middle class, upper class people, and you can see them in portraits or in reenactors. But again, that's about the time of that first census for Marblehead, when George Washington was elected president. Jumping forward to finally recovering from the War of 1812, because so many people were POWs, half of the men and boys who went to war had been imprisoned. 1830, the town is still really small. We still need a fort though, but it's really falling into disuse by that time because there's not that much happening, and there's a navy being built up and an army, but we don't have a lot of conflicts. And Marblehead really recovers a lot in the 1830s. And then the gale of 1846 happens, where a third of the fishing fleet was taken out, with 65 men and boys lost, 43 widows, and 155 fatherless children. I should have had a credit there at the bottom of the screen to the Marblehead Museum's collection. So many people were lost to the sea. Marblehead finally got its men off the water by 1850, and it was mainly because of the women. And I encourage you to read the book, The Women of Marblehead, to find out more about that story by Robert Booth. commissioned by the Marblehead Female Humane Society, which was started in 1816 because there were so many widows from the fishing. So by 1850, when this awesome map was done, we're shoemaking, and the fort is not doing very much. So there's the fort by 1860. Just the palisades, no trees. Another view of it. Thank you, Rick Ashley, for this photo from the Fred Goddard collection. Then the Civil War hits. Another 1,000 men and boys served. Not as many died, not as many imprisoned, but enough. Thank you very much. Even one is a lot. Very brutal war. Death was at everybody's doorstep in that war. Many from prisons, being imprisoned, and from disease. But look what happens to our fort in the Civil War. Oh my goodness, 1864, 3 years into it. We get this whole upper parade on the left that was land appropriated and leased, as I've been told, from the Brown family for the fort, with 12 gun emplacements there, big guns. At least one was a 32-pounder. That's a lot. But within 3 years, the fort's looking like it's in ruins again. And that can happen. This is what the fort looks like now, after just a year. So the fort really went to seed a lot. Every time after it was used, it would have to be renovated again. So by the 1860s and 70s, it's not really very much of a fort. People start wanting to walk around there. Nobody's using it. Nobody's saying go away. It's still part of the federal government, but they start to put benches out there, and it becomes more of a recreational space. The houses, fancier summer houses, start being built. There's the fort still being able to see those ramparts. And this is the yachting era in the 1880s, and the yacht clubs, 1870s and 80s, the yacht clubs are built. This is Marblehead. By that time, it's really expanding farther to the west and a little bit to the south, but not really a lot till after the World Wars. World War I, they expanded south down Atlantic Avenue. After World War II, a lot of the West Shore was developed. And here's the fort, 1880s. Those ramparts are still there in the private property. So the Brown family keeps having to petition the government for claims for, their land there as late as the 1880s. Still there in the 1888 map, the fort ramparts there of some sort. But Benjamin Williams' Crown and Shield in the 1880s really lobbies the government for the fort to become a park. And he goes back and forth a lot in the Marblehead Messenger, which you can read it through the library's digital copies of the Messenger back then. Again, if you go back to the YouTube sometime, you can look more about the islands, but this slide tells a little bit about how the islands adjusted, but it was Benjamin Crowninshield who was lobbying for the fort, who also then bought part of the non-Brown side of the Great Island. And then in 1918, his son bought the rest of the island from the Browns. So the island is in full Crowninshield ownership from 1918 to 1955. But in 1889, then the fort does become a pleasure ground under the custodianship of Mr. B.W. Crowninshield, Benjamin Williams Crowninshield. So his goal was realized, his petitions paid off. And in 1890, the year after, the Army Corps of Engineers certifies that there are no guns or carriages on hand, no platforms ready for armament. So that's reassuring for the people who are enjoying it. And that's right about the time the light tower is built, 1897. It's the sailing, the ferries, the harbor. It's all about the harbor and the summer houses and the lighthouse, the light tower out there. And whoa, bam, war. Again, 1898. Remember the Maine down in Cuba. The USS Marblehead is down there on the lower right. Forgot to put the ID in. But we went to war. We got to do that, but it only lasted a few months, fortunately. And I'm very intrigued by this photograph. Those are the kinds of boats that were involved, ships that were involved in that war. I'm not sure why they're off Marblehead Harbor, but it was interesting enough for somebody to take a photograph. But that's Gary's Island, Mavericks, then Reefs, then Gary's, with houses out on it. And there was a house at one point, a structure out on Browns Island as well. But here's the fort coming into service again during the war of the Spanish-American War. And there's the ramp looking really steep. So that's what we're trying to level out for the accessibility. And that war year is the same year that the Marblehead Historical Society was established in 1898. And in 1998, it bought this building where it is now for its offices and gallery, changing gallery space, and the J.O.J. Frost Gallery. So the Fort Sewall Promenade is going strong in 1900 after that short war, the Spanish-American War. It becomes a place of enjoyment. Look at the dirt road, getting everybody's dresses dirty and muddy in the rain, but we don't have that many rains, right? 1909, this is a map that was published showing the fort. The houses start being built on that western section of the fort. And that's the same year that this map was published that the Marblehead Museum and the Historical Society then bought the Lee Mansion. There's Fountain Park. It became a park in 1881. And the fort is, for all intents and purposes, a park. And then in 1922, the government turned it over to the town of Marblehead, turned the fort over to the town of Marblehead as a place of pleasure forever. And that's in the deed, forever. So we're going to celebrate that in 1922. In 2022, we're going to celebrate that 100th year anniversary. And I hope this has given you a little bit of an idea about the many lives of this fort and how we can appreciate it in more comprehensive ways to appreciate what everybody lived through in these hard times that were also global times. And that's what we're doing now too. So that is it.
Thank you so much, Judy. That was fascinating. If anybody has a question, feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat box, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, Judy, I have a question.
Yeah, hi.
Do we know, was there any evidence that any cannon was fired in anger from the fort at any time?
There's a one episode happened at the time of the Revolution. And I think while I was like doing some yard work or something, I thought, oh, I got to look that up. And then I forgot. But Rick Detwiller is on this call. Rick, he's the one who's been doing the research. Can you answer that question? Can you unmute yourself, Rick? You might know the answer there. It's probably in Rhodes history, but my recollection is that something was fired. Hi, Rick.
Hi. Well, we know that Ashley Bowen said that a gun exploded at the fort. I think it was in December of '75, right after they finished building it, or rebuilding it, I would say. At any rate, they captured a schooner right off the fort where it had anchored. It was taking refuge. It was going from Barbados or somewhere to Boston, and they captured supplies meant for the people in Boston. So that happened right off the fort. And it led to that whole incident where I suspect Washington visited Marblehead. He was definitely visiting the shores around Chelsea because he billed the treasury for his visits to the North Shore at exactly the same time that Glover was starting his fleet, because it was Washington's secret navy, as some people have recently read, I'm sure. At any rate, the specific incident Judy's talking about, I think it might have been involved a lively, but there was not any exchange of fire. They did a lot of saluting of the ships that would come in. Manley and Glover would come in, whoever, with a new frigate or whatever built recently during the war. So in the 1770s, even after the British left Boston, they had a lot of exercise firing their guns, saluting each other. So that would be the principal activity at the fort.
So we're actually hoping that Rick can come back and give a talk in the spring, because he's the guy who's been researching all of what really was happening at the fort. I was giving you context, And he's got a little bit more, he's got a lot more of the nuts and bolts. So hopefully we can bring you back and tune in again. So more questions.
It looks like there's a question in the chat. Somebody's asking where the image of Rock Haven was taken from. It looks like a postcard.
Yeah, this is a postcard. And as you're coming down, pretty much as you're coming down Selman and Franklin streets, you end up at Fort Beach. And that if you look back down toward town, toward downtown, that's the perspective that this would have been. And you know, when you see Dan Dixie's slideshows about all the different photos and postcards and photographs of Marblehead, everyone's always trying to figure out, and Dan too, you know, what perspective everything's taken from, and anybody else who collects photographs, because so many people love to. And yeah, it's always a little bit dicey. And someday we should do like a mapping project to map all these places and where they were. There's so many opportunities and things you could do if you just had time and whatever. So, but it's probably pretty much around where the 4-story apartments are on the left.
And it looks like Don, Don, you can go ahead and answer, ask your question.
Yeah, Judy, Don Dolliver.
Hi, Don. You can probably answer a lot of questions.
By legend, the fort fired at the 2 British ships chasing the Constitution in. I've never seen that really documented. I've seen newspaper accounts about artillery coming to Marblehead from Salem and Beverly.
Yeah, and that's in the War of 1812, right?
1812, yeah. So that may be an incident of a cannon being fired in anger.
And then there's the other flip side of that legend or oral history, not a legend necessarily, about that the fort had cannon but no powder and couldn't, it just made a good show of being able to defend itself, but really couldn't. So
that's what I was just going to ask, because I've heard the story that they had it filled with silverware, but nothing else.
and I'm thinking a lot of people in Marblehead did not have silverware. I think most of the silverware went away. Any silver probably was gone by 1775. You know, Ashley Bowen speaks to that. He says that all of our countrymen are become pawnbrokers, countrymen meaning people in inland Massachusetts, are becoming pawnbrokers for the Marblehead men's goods. I mean, Marblehead knew that the bottom was falling out of its economy in 1775 with that closure of the fishing banks. So they were trying to liquidate anything they could because they knew bad times were coming. So I don't think there's a lot of silver in Marblehead anytime after that. But charades work. They worked in World War II. They work a lot. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Judy, the recent renovations on the fort, is the fort being restored to a particular point in time or a particular design, or is it sort of a general history, what the fort might have looked at over several years?
Not much is happening at all that will be different. When you go back in the spring, it's going to pretty much look the way you remember it. There'll be that path up the left side, which may have existed back in the day. The ramparts certainly will still have a path. They don't have gun emplacements, but what we're going to try and do is have some silhouettes of guns, of cannon in a few places to suggest that there might have been gun placements in that area or where they might have been based on some of the plans. Then the one major change, the magazines will stay the same, the white building, the officers' quarters, the bomb-proof quarters, as they called it on the plans, those will stay the same. They've been preserved, and that was wonderful preservation work that the Massachusetts Historical Commission provided funding for. But for the paths, at the upper rampart area, a simulated gun deck will be built to suggest that this was not just a fun place to walk around, that it was once a fort. And with the silhouettes that you can just walk on, you know, they're going to be etched in stone, as they say, of guns pointing out, not at anybody's heads on the, on the benches, but you can walk on the gun deck and get a sense that, wow, this was a fort, really? I think kind of for the first time. Because now we don't sense it as a fort as
Yeah.
much.
One other question, do we have any idea of what the maximum number of personnel would have been at any one particular time serving duty at the fort?
I don't know that we have records of who was there necessarily. There may be some, and there probably were some. The Marblehead Light Infantry was out there for a while during the War of 1812. I remember a figure of 121
Yeah.
members of the Marblehead Light Infantry. When Glover's regiment does their encampment, they have quite a few people there, their families, obviously, and some of the women who would have been in camps, in field camps. I think at Fort Sewall, women wouldn't have been as much a part of that camp because the homes are so close by,
Yeah.
but it was probably 100 or so. Certainly not as crowded as the Culinary Arts Festival.
Okay.
But the tents were always kind of stacked up right in a row there. And there's some talk, and Larry Sands is on the call on the Zoom too. He could probably speak to a little bit, or Bob Booth if he's here. The so-called Hearth and Eagle House, which was a Gary house for some of his progeny, Thomas Gary, the father of Elbridge. Elbridge Gary was the brother of that little kid that we saw in the fancy waistcoat. The kid was the older brother, and Elbridge was the younger brother. That house was supposed to have housed officers when Commander or Captain Conklin lived there, and they were supposed to house officers from the whatever infantry was stationed out at the fort, and the tents would have been for the rank and file. So it probably varied, but maybe 100 or two. Larry, what do you think? Are you there?
Judy,
Yeah, Judy, actually, I think it may have been that many. The numbers I saw at one point, which I think was somewhere around the War of 1812, was about 40 people.
Okay.
But it depended what was going on, I think.
Well, and I think Bob Booth could probably answer this question as
I
well.
could add a little to that too. I think it was Reverend William Bentley who said there were 44 guys. The barracks were equipped for 44 right before the War of 1812. And what was interesting to me was that he pointed out that the commander of Fort Pickering actually was staying in Salem at the fort there, which was interesting. I mean, in Marblehead. So they would go back and forth, and some of the exercises involved both. And the crew from the fort would obviously go out to Naugus Head and do their military exercises out there occasionally. So the two forts were operated as a kind of a system.
The two forts, meaning Fort
Pickering and
Naugus Head. That
yeah.
became Camp Miller, I think, at one point too, Naugus Head.
Yeah, so there were activities all over.
Judy,
Yeah, Don, go ahead.
question. In the renovation of the fort, did they find any archaeological items?
We were the committee and probably everybody in town was hoping they would find something, and almost zero. So what we're wondering is, well, they did find a cameo, and that's going to come back to Marblehead after the surveys reports are completed and so forth. We're figuring that fort was a place of recreation for 125 years now, that anything that could be found was probably found already. And when they did the archaeological survey before the work started, they were coming up with almost nothing. Larry, you can add to that too, I'm sure.
We did find some bones when we were doing an excavation that led to a rather interesting day when we had the police detective and the medical examiner's office from the Commonwealth, but
I
they
forgot about that.
determined that they were non-human. So that saved us. We thought maybe we had found Jimmy Hoffa or something exciting, but nothing. It's amazing. Even when we turned over lots of the earth, there was very little there. So
Well, if people are still on, I hope you will go buy yourself a Hestia ornament, contribute to the fort, so we can have a fort ranger program for going inside those officers' quarters and the bomb-proof quarters, and we'll be able to train the guides for the weekends. And I think it'll be really nice to be able to go inside the fort and experience it.
A question?
Yeah.
First, would it be possible for you to show that early owners with the Mavericks there, where you had showed the picture of Little Harbor and the fort?
Can I, Amy, are we up or down? Yes, here we are. Okay.
You still have screen sharing power. You're good.
Okay. So let's see, this was Crown and Shields, this one. Okay, the Mavericks were earlier. This was a lot of pictures. Okay, here we go. I'm going to keep the others up just so I can see them. So Mavericks Island, where am I? All right, so Moses Maverick owned what we now know as Gary's Island from 1635 to 1675. He sold the island to Richard Reith in 1675. 1674, he sold his land on what became Gale's Head to Ambrose Gale, where the fort, that's the headland where the fort is. Richard Reith and his son and grandson, Richard Reith Sr. died, then Junior died, then the son got it. The three of them had it for 75 years. And from what Bob Booth has told me, the Richard Reith #3, sort of like the Turner family in Salem at the House of the Seven Gables, the first guy makes the money, the second guy enjoys the money, and the third guy loses the money. So I think from what Bob Booth told me was that he lost it, this young Richard Reith, 40-year-old, whatever, lost it in a debt to Thomas Gary. So Gary got the island by default and owned it. And that's what it's named after. It's not Elbridge Gary's Island, it's Thomas Gary's Island. And Thomas Gary is the dad of that young boy in the waistcoat, that portrait. So do you have a question in particular about that?
So actually,
Hello?
he had the question I sent to you earlier, Judy.
Oh, okay.
You have that up.
And that was the question about, was anything fortified in the 1630s? So yes, the Salem forts were fortified before the Marblehead forts, basically. Let's see, where was that? Yeah, that's not it. I have to go back to my. I think it's interesting if you look at the map to think about, oh, let's go with this. One before that. That we have to, no, not there. We have to think of the water as the important part. And the land, it's important in its own right, but it's sort of like the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean. Everybody wanted to own the perimeter. So that's what the fort at Naugus Head. No, that's a Little Harbor again. There we go. There. That's what the fort at Naugus Head was all about, right here. Go back one.
Yeah, I think the question was along
Anyway.
the lines of, was it fortified in regards to Charles I and the Archbishop potentially sending someone over to take control of New England?
Well, that certainly happened with Governor Andros later on, but I don't know that episode in our early history. So I'd have to defer to somebody else on that one. But I can answer that the forts were getting fortified. These areas were getting fortified right at the mouth of this harbor, Naugus Head and Salem. And then later they became Camp Miller, and later they became Fort Pickering, and later they became Fort Sewell and all that. Same thing happened in Portsmouth. Fort William and Mary became Fort Constitution. Castle William became Fort Independence in the Boston Harbor Islands. So I don't know about that episode. Somebody else is going to have to find out about that, sending somebody over.
Yay, a mystery of history that we can take some time to try to figure out. Does anybody else have a question before we wrap up?
Is anybody left?
There's so many other people on this call still. I mean, we can go all night. I'm just kidding. Don't actually think we're doing that. Anything else? Okie dokie.
Okay, and if you go see the movie about Queen Anne, take it with a grain of salt because she was actually a very astute leader, and she kind of got short shrift in the movie, as the movies often do. But she's a very interesting person, and she really her reign in that war really impacted Marblehead. And if it hadn't been for that England winning the war and that treaty in 1713, Marblehead wouldn't be what it is potentially.
True.
So.
Well, thank you so much, Judy. This was fabulous.
And thank you all for your interest, and for you at the museum. Thank you for hosting it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.
Right.